Thank you so much. Barev ses shat urachem says handipem. Hayren chemhosu.
Greetings so very much. I don't speak Armenian much, so I'll join.
You all so much for having me here, both American University and Yerevan State University, for organizing this event. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Thank you also to our translator in the back of the room. Thanks so much. And it's true that I wanted to share with you an approach that we are using now to treat this topic of unsustainable consumption. And at the same time, I very much want to learn from you. I'm here until mid-August, and if there are other opportunities to exchange, whether in the classroom or in other instances, do reach out to me, because I'm very curious also to hear the work that you're doing here in Armenia. So the talk today is about sustainable consumption. And I've designed it as a workshop. We will see how that goes and how you feel about working together with me on this topic. I thought I would start with an introduction to sustainable consumption and what sociology can offer. Then there will be this workshop at the tables, and maybe I will encourage some people from the back of the room, if you want to participate, to come to the tables. And then we will spend a bit of time debriefing, and I'm going to end, if not exactly at 12:30, a little bit before, because I'm sure everyone will want to break for lunch. I've learned that meals are very important in Armenia, so we definitely don't want to miss a lunch. So first, to introduce this topic of sustainable consumption, as Alan mentioned, there is a sustainable development goal on consumption and production. When I entered in this field some 20 years ago, all of the focus was on sustainable production. It was about trying to imagine ways to better design products. It was about reflecting on industrial symbiosis. This is where industrial ecology emerged as a very strong approach, thinking of things like the life cycle impacts of products. So a lot of emphasis and focus on systems of production. The question of consumption remained very much this black box of complexity. What do we do about consumers? At the very best, we put a label on a product and we ask consumers to make a better choice. Or perhaps we think of information campaigns. But perhaps you might agree that after so many decades of informing consumers, we are not engaging people towards the kind of sustainable transitions that we really want to put forward. So why is this? And how can sociology bring another understanding of consumption dynamics? Before I get started, I also wanted to reference, of course, two of the most pressing issues today in terms of environmental impacts is the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. In the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the last IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, a new word was introduced. And this word is sufficiency. Something's happening with the mic. Is it okay?
Felix is playing around.
Okay. So even in relation to our economies and how we use energy, and now in relation to the climate crises, we always recognize the need to have more efficient technologies and to introduce more renewable technologies, right? These two things have always been discussed and put forward. But now, even in these reports, we are talking about sufficiency, which assumes the need to reduce consumption. Now, I realize that I'm talking in the context of Armenia, where many people may not have the sufficient level of consumption in terms of access to clean energy, access to healthy diets, etc. Clearly, in Europe, we are way above the level of consumption we should have for a sustainable transition. Nonetheless, how about now? Perfect. Oh, I'll keep it close. Is that okay? Yeah. All right. So in Europe, 4 domains of consumption have been recognized as having the most environmental impact across different categories: carbon emissions, water usage, et cetera, et cetera. They may not exactly apply to Armenia, but nonetheless, they tend to be the consumption domains that around the world are recognized as being related to unsustainable consumption patterns. And these are mobility, so fossil fuel-based mobility, getting around using petrol, food, especially meat and dairy consumption, building consumption, but not so much the construction of buildings, but what we do as people in buildings. We use energy for heating. This is the highest impact category in Switzerland. And increasingly, we will be using energy, no doubt, for cooling as well as our cities get hotter and hotter. And a 4th category is emerging now that's more and more recognized as one of the priority areas as far as consumption is concerned, of course. And this is fashion, clothing, accessories, etc., that also are recognized as having a very heavy impact in environmental terms. So what I wanted to do with you was take each of these categories and show you why I think a sociological approach is useful. You'll tell me what you think also. So for example, if you look at mobility, you could say to yourself, well, people need to get around. So why don't we simply introduce public transport? It would be easy, no? People want to get from A to B. But in fact, getting around is so much more than just moving from one point to another. These cars that we also see in Yerevan, it is such an interesting city, Yerevan, in terms of car culture. I think even in Geneva, one of the most expensive cities in the world, I have not seen a stretch limo Hummer, or what is it called? These cars that you have here, it's astounding. So what do we know from sociology? We know that cars are a status symbol. People drive around in cars to communicate their wealth and status to others. And as long as we have a culture where cars continue to be something people aspire to as a status symbol, it would be very difficult to get rid of them. So people might say, yes, I'd like to reduce private transport, but they say a car is a form of status and prestige. And if you dig a little deeper, people also have a very strong sense of comfort and security in their larger and larger cars. And this idea of, safely transporting their family members from one point to another. What we saw in Switzerland around the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, a lot of people left public transport because of health issues, fears around contamination, and used their cars even more. But luckily, bicycles made their way in. I'll get to that in a moment. So the first category, cars. The second category, or related to the first category, transport, getting around by flying, which I also took an airplane to come to Armenia. So here, what we notice in sociology is that there can be a gap between what people believe and what they do, and a gap between what they believe to be the impacts and the actual impacts. So you ask people, are you an environmental citizen? Are you environmentally conscious? They'll say yes. Maybe they recycle, maybe they try to walk instead of take their car, etc. But their environmental consciousness might also translate to flying to Thailand to stay in an eco resort, right? And we know that flying has a huge environmental impact. Here also, we could maybe talk about status consumption, but we also talk about this value action gap between what people believe and what they actually do. And oftentimes what they do might be very segmented. In certain categories of consumption, you will make an effort, but maybe not in other categories. So I tried to find an Armenian picture of an Armenian meal. As Alan was saying over coffee, we obviously cannot assume that everyone in Armenia has access to a heavy meat diet. There are no doubt people that are undernourished, and meat is not accessible to everyone. But when you go and have a meal in Armenia, if it's a celebratory meal, meat has a very important role, right? So how are we going to reduce meat consumption in a context where meat is very symbolic, tied to tradition, culinary traditions, tied to moments of festivity, rituals, tied to sharing, right? The convivial aspect of food in Armenia, which I can tell you I'm really appreciating. In Switzerland, I would have shown the fondue. We use melted cheese, right, as a traditional dish. But we know that beef particularly is very intensive, particularly when it comes to the import of fodder for feeding cows, and how this relates to deforestation and carbon emissions. So not so easy to change diets. And there is also this tendency in Switzerland to say, well, let's just inform people and they will behave better. Let's let them exercise their so-called freedom of choice. But what we realize is that, in fact, people do not have that much choice. Sometimes they're limited by what is offered, or they are limited by the time they have available. And in Switzerland, I make the joke that if you want to go to a supermarket and find a product that is 100% sustainable, both in terms of environmental, social indicators, etc., you might spend 2 hours looking at all the different labels. There are 170 labels on food products in Switzerland. So you should do a PhD if you want to buy a sustainable, bread or pastry or something like this. And somehow this idea of informing consumers can be criticized as a way of giving too much responsibility to individuals at the expense of systems of production, retailers, for example, who should perhaps be deciding what should or should not be on supermarket shelves. I've noticed here in Armenia, though, that you do have probably more of a approach to seasonal produce than we have in Switzerland. So in Switzerland, you can get tomatoes all year round. Is it the case here in Armenia, or are there seasons where you don't eat tomatoes? Or you get tomatoes all year round in Armenia? Yeah. Okay. Under greenhouses. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the eminent scholars working with the approach that I'm going to present to you today is Elizabeth Shove out of Lancaster in the UK. And she very much criticizes this approach of individual choice based on better informing people. And she uses this very sort of infantile idea of the ABC approach, saying that we cannot simply influence attitudes to then affect behavior and choice. She sees this as a very linear relationship, and she proposes another approach, social practice theory, which I'm going to discuss with you today. But the approach that I want to share with you really at its basis has this idea that we should be going beyond trying to inform people to be better individuals. This is another category that I quite like, that I've worked on a lot, energy consumption in the home. And there's this idea that if we just buy more efficient appliances, then we will reduce energy usage. The problem is appliances are getting bigger and bigger and more numerous. And so there are rebound effects in relation to energy efficiency. Here's some pictures I've taken from field work in Switzerland. I don't know if it's the case in Armenia, but little by little, we are seeing more and more American-style refrigerators appearing. Is this the case here as well? So the typical Swiss refrigerator was probably about that big. I don't know how many liters that is, but it has now tripled in size. So of course, we have more efficient appliances, but these appliances are getting bigger. So they're using more energy than the smaller versions. This, I assure you, is not standard. It is in a very wealthy household in Geneva. I found a double dishwashing machine. And it is maybe not used all the time as a double, as a double unit. But it is completely coherent with the idea in Europe that the kitchen should be a place almost of performance, where you prepare meals now with your guests. It's not like the kitchen is hidden in an area. It's now become a social space. And in that kitchen, there should be not even one spoon left on the counter. Everything should be put away. All the dirt, you know, anything that's unclean should be put away. So it's very coherent for this household. They are only 4 in the household, but they have a double dishwashing machine for invitations and things like this. And what's interesting to me is not to say this is good or bad, but just to notice how certain things become normal over time. And why do they become normal? And what are our expectations around certain consumption categories? Another excellent example is for cars, right? We have rendered cars more and more efficient in energy terms, but they are getting bigger and bigger. And so the energy savings in Europe from car efficiency is completely outdone by the now prevalence of SUV cars, 4x4 cars, which I also see many of them here in Yerevan. I heard that SUVs, is that how you call them here, or 4x4s? The big cars worldwide emit as much emissions as the whole country of Germany. I saw this statistic somewhere. So yes, we do need energy efficiency. It is essential to have buildings and to have appliances that are more and more efficient. But if we're not thinking of sufficiency and of reducing consumption, then in the end, it's a no-winners game. In my work, therefore, I tend to be a little bit critical of technological solutions. I often tell my students or others who have done the same exercise that you're going to do today. I've done it with city officials in Geneva. I've worked with the public sector to do the same workshop. And I've told them, you cannot come with the solution of an app, another application. Trying to get people to think of solutions that are not solely technologically driven and that are more about also changing the normative dimension of consumption, trying to challenge the culture around cars or the culture around meat, waste, etc. If we look at fashion now, another critique we could bring is that if each individual makes an effort, then we will arrive at change. This individualization of responsibility is problematic because it puts a lot of emphasis on individual consumption decisions, rather than looking at collective changes that need to happen even before we make the decision to buy or to not buy. And in Europe, at least, when you ask people to consume sustainably, particularly when it comes to fashion, you're asking them to buy very expensive products. So we have this problem now in Europe that people who conceive themselves as being ecological citizens or environmental citizens are actually a very wealthy, highly educated elite. So is this what we're proposing as a solution to sustainability, that you have to become very rich to be able to buy your 200 euro Vega shoes or your 300 euro pair of jeans? This is very problematic if this is what we're proposing as the solution to sustainability. It's a problem in terms of money. It's also a problem in relation to time. I have a little note in the back of my head when I work on sustainable consumption programs to not be putting forward ideas that are creating more work for women. In Switzerland, we are also in a very gendered society where women are still primarily responsible for many of the domestic chores, preparing meals, caring for children, etc. So when we ask people to recycle, when we ask people to make their own organic food or grow their own organic food, when we ask them to use reusable diapers, all of these sustainable consumption tasks tend to be gendered towards women. And we have to be careful about that as well. We cannot be creating more work for women. So this is how I get to these myths about sustainable consumption, myths that we really need to challenge when we're thinking about how to engage in sustainable consumption transitions. Because I think we've very much kept this idea that we have ecological superheroes who as individuals are going to save the world, basically, right? And they're going to save it by recycling or things like this. And we really have to get beyond this very individualized approach to consumption, because individual actions will not suffice. They tend to render invisible the political context in which consumption is taking place. The idea that informing people is the only solution is also insufficient. Of course, we must inform. There should be information campaigns, but it's not enough. Only people who are interested are going to be engaged. More efficient technologies are needed, but also we need to be thinking about sufficiency and how to reduce consumption in some contexts. Like I said before, maybe some people are not consuming enough. The idea of simply adjusting the prices can also be problematic. And the idea that everyone has the skills and resources to be involved is also problematic. So how do we recruit largely and widely? So I don't know, are you convinced by these myths? Are you ready to see what solution maybe we propose now that I've sort of taken down the different ways that we shouldn't be moving forward? Or does anyone have any questions for this first part? Or maybe illustrations from your own experiences that you want to share? Yes.
Yes, maybe one short story. I was very strongly, hardly criticized by UNDP folks who invited me as a speaker for, in a youth, for workshop for youth, young people. When I said, okay, guys, you've heard a lot that, you should have the tap water closed while you are brushing teeth. That's great. Yeah, that's great, really. But, you have to know that one factory, one industry, just an industrial facility can waste so much drinking water in a day that your whole family and your bigger family cannot save that much water in the entire lifespan. So I was very strongly criticized by your UNDP, representative, like, what are you teaching? What is the message you want to deliver? No, that's exactly what I'm saying. Just what you heard. That you have to be conscious as young people, and this is about the first myth, and I'm very happy to see it here. So yeah.
Thank you for that. There is a comedian in Switzerland who's made some sketches on climate change, and she makes this joke: we tell people to turn off the lights when they're brushing their teeth, and this is not going to save the planet. Something like this. Great. Yes.
And I don't know if this is directly related to this first myth, but what we have found out, and I don't think we understand it enough, Harut, when we did this waste composition and quantity and composition study a couple of years ago, we were astonished to find out that on the average, about 40 to 50% of the municipal solid waste was food waste, kitchen waste. Are we that rich to be able to waste half? I mean, no industry can afford half of its input as waste. So, I mean, there's some paradoxes, I think, in consumption that.
Waste is a very interesting issue, and we're going to talk about it later in your class. I think I'm going to go meet your students, because in the UK also, there has been this rather important research project looking at food waste and realizing that nobody likes to waste food. Nobody is happy wasting food, and yet we do waste. And why is that the case? And I'm surprised to see the rates are so high here. And it may have to do with many aspects, let's say in a more social, cultural context, that, for example, make it necessary to have an abundant meal. There should never be too little food on the table. There should always be too much food. For example, if you're inviting guests over, this is a cultural way, right, of representing the meal. Another issue that we found in our own research is how people buy food. If you are able to have the time to buy on a regular basis, you waste less. But as people become more busy and more women are more and more engaged in the workforce, maybe you don't have time to shop so regularly. So you have a stock, and it's not so easy to manage that stock. We looked at waste in Bangalore in India among the middle classes, where everyone has a cook. A domestic helper comes either full-time or for 1 or 2 hours of the day to prepare meals, these elaborate Indian meals, I guess. There's no waste in these households because they have someone professional who is handling their food stock, if you will. They also have a culture where you do not eat leftovers yourself, but you pass them down in a very stratified society from the upper classes to the lower classes. So the leftovers get passed down. Of course, we don't have this in Switzerland. If you open my fridge in Switzerland, you will definitely find food in the back of the fridge that is wasting away. We don't manage our stock professionally, let's say. And then, like as I said before, there's also this culture of abundance that we could in the Philippines, they got around this issue in restaurants. It could be interesting for Armenia by proposing small, medium, and large size dishes. Because the Philippines is also a culture of sharing food. You order for the table. In Europe, everyone orders for themselves. But this is, again, sometimes wasteful. And so they instituted a process in restaurants where you can order a small size plate, for example, to have less. But we'll talk about more. If you're interested in food waste, we can come back to it in the Q&A. So you might be asking, okay, what is she proposing? She's just criticized these different ways of approaching consumption. What I'm proposing is a sociological way of understanding consumption that has to do with many of the routines and habits that people engage in. So I like to show a picture of a family having a meal. So I tried to find a picture of an Armenian family on the internet. The idea here is that people wake up in the morning, they prepare coffee, they check their emails, they do a number of things that use energy, but that are not, let's say, that are not done in a way that is highly reflexive. People are not thinking when they turn on the light, when they check their emails, about the energy they're consuming. Energy is part of part of services they receive to cook meals, to stay warm, etc., but are very much tied up with everyday life dynamics, routines, habits. And it is these routines and habits that we need to understand to then be able to intervene or propose initiatives that really help break into what has become habitual and routinized. So this is what this theoretical framework offers. It's about looking at everyday consumption dynamics, and we say social material context, because what we mean by that is that everything that is material is also somehow socially constructed. So the fact that we came into the room through the door, that we're sitting at chairs that are arranged this way, that I'm up here with a microphone, all of this involves material arrangements, but they were also designed, right, and planned by humans. So even if you think of city infrastructures, I know we have some architects in the room, and if there are urban planners that are here, I mean, everything that we construct and build, of course, also has a social basis. So that's why we say social material context. So here is the approach that I use. It is not perfect. At the very end of the talk, I'll show you its limitations. There are some limitations, of course, but it is an approach called social practice theory, or looking at everyday life through social practices. And the way it works, it's a very useful tool, I find, for research to understand what's going on, but it can also be used for social change, to understand a problem and then intervene in that problem. So what you do with this approach is you consider a practice. A practice tends to be a verb, something like preparing a meal, getting around, etc. I like to say, if you can write a guidebook about it, it's a practice. So preparing a meal is a practice, but probably frying an egg is too small. It's an action. So you have to think of a practice as something that is recognizable collectively as an entity. Social practices have these different elements that hold them together. They include social norms and rules. Like I said, this idea of food being abundant when you are offering food to people. They involve economic resources and material things. They involve skills, competencies, and beliefs of people who are practicing them. And they also involve social relations. And I'm going to show you, I'll give you an example of of how this theory plays out. So in Switzerland, during the pandemic, there was, as I said before, a fear of public transport and a lot of people resorting to private cars. But at the same time, there was a huge appeal, a sudden appeal for biking. Geneva is also a car-based city. We have a big car fair every year. People like to drive luxury cars in the city as well. And yet bicycles have now emerged very strongly during the pandemic. And why? We can look at it through social practice theory. So biking in Geneva was made possible primarily because the city already had plans to develop more bicycle lanes, but during the pandemic, they were able to just deploy them at a very fast rate. So more and more access to bike lanes. Bike lanes were central, I think, to the practice of more people engaging in biking because people needed a secure way to get around by bikes, a way that they felt was protected from the dominance of cars. These bike lanes were very visible. Some of them were painted pink in the city. And indeed, people had access to bikes. In some parts of the city, like Yerevan, there are steep hills. And in Geneva, people can afford electric bicycles. And there was a huge rush to purchase electric bicycles and the materials that go with them, helmets, et cetera, et cetera. So here you might also be saying, okay, here again, we were talking about a certain middle class or upper middle class that can afford. It's true. But there are a lot of people on regular bikes, not electric bikes, and there's a huge secondhand bicycle market in Switzerland. So almost every other week, somewhere in the city, there's a bike fair where you can go and get a secondhand bike. They also get stolen regularly in Geneva. But indeed, people had access to bicycles and more bicycle repair shops also emerged. And in fact, there was a time during the pandemic where you couldn't even find an electric bicycle anymore because so many people were rushing to buy them. So that is the material and economic aspect of the practice. But it also had to do with skills, competencies, and beliefs. People at a young age learn how to ride bikes in Switzerland. So it's something you do as a child, but I think in Armenia as well. No, I've seen in our building, there are some bicycles for children around. But increasingly also, there is a belief that biking is not so much for environmental reasons, but is for human health. And this is something that I come across quite regularly when looking at environmental issues in relation to consumption. Some people do not care so much about environmental issues, but when it comes to their personal health, they will be engaged. So biking is an example, but also maybe eating less meat for health reasons can be a promising way forward. Social relations were important. So seeing people in the workplace bike, seeing more people on bikes, and all of this contributed to the normative dimension of the practice. Seeing so many people take to bike lanes in Geneva had this effect of normalizing what it means to get around. And I think this also contributed to making biking something that is socially acceptable. And maybe there was a bit of status involved as well. If you have the latest bicycle, you know, how can we do this in Yerevan? Get people to see electric bicycles as a status symbol instead of the Hummer, for example, you know? So you can do this kind of exercise to understand how a sustainable practice has been implemented, but you can also do it, and that's what I wanted to do with you today, if you agree to do an exercise together. You can also look at unsustainable practices, like air conditioning, for example. So I did a lot of work in the Philippines, in Manila, and I looked at how people stay cool in the Philippines and how this is tied to air conditioning usage, which is problematic in terms of energy consumption, but also because air conditioning units release heat into the microclimate of cities, contributing to the urban heat island phenomenon, whereby it is 2-3 degrees warmer in Manila than it is in surrounding areas. So here, social norms were very important when it came to air conditioning usage in the Philippines, because a lot of workplaces had dress standards that were maybe left over from the American colonial period, where particularly administrative staff had to wear polyester suits, tights, etc. Men also had to wear ties and shirts, etc. So I'm not seeing any ties in the room, but in that culture, there was still this dominant idea of what the workplace attire should look like. Actually, this norm was contested quite directly in Japan with something called the Cool Biz campaign, where the Ministry of the Environment came out and said, no more shirts and ties in Japan in the summer. And this was even before Fukushima. Let us engage in cool business attire, short sleeves, etc. It worked very well in Japan, where you have maybe more of a top-down or maybe more of a trust in government. They tried to do the same thing in Italy. They were ridiculed. The Italians said, you know, we're not going to take off our tie to save the climate. And maybe in Italy, they have another sense of fashion. Huh? They don't want to be told what to wear. But of course, for certain practices, some of these elements of practices would be more important and will have a stronger hold on the practices than others. In the case of air conditioning, material arrangements are very important. If you build a building that needs artificial cooling, it is locking in the need for energy usage for years to come, versus if you build a building that allows for some form of passive ventilation, right? So here the material arrangements were very important, and unfortunately, a lot of the post-war buildings in the Philippines today that were built with the climate in mind are being torn down and replaced by these glass skyscrapers, which are completely inappropriate for the tropical climate, but that people imagine as being ecological, let's say. So there are these trends also in relation to imaginaries around architecture that are interesting. But in the Philippines, their energy is non-subsidized, so the kilowatt hour is among the most expensive in the world, and therefore people in the Philippines are very creative when it comes to being better, let's say, being more sufficient with their energy cooling needs. They know how to ventilate the homes. Sometimes they walk around with these little, they wet a towel to put on their neck and wear this during the day to stay cool. So they have different technologies, let's say low-tech technologies for keeping cool. And all this also relates to social relations. Interestingly, in Manila, people tend to sleep together in one room, the entire family, because air conditioning is so expensive. If they're going to use it, it's sort of like in the olden days, we would all group around the fire, as the fireplace is the center of the home. In the Philippines, the air conditioning unit has this effect of bringing people together in one room. So co-sleeping is very common in the Philippines. So you see how you can look at this kind of practice, which is maybe unsustainable, and you can work with these different elements to describe that practice. And then the next step is to intervene. Once you've described these different elements, you should be able to, for example, focus on workplace attire and devise a campaign that specifically looks at the links between air conditioning and workplace. Or there could be an intervention here in how architectural schools are thinking about passive cooling, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of the approach is that you should be able to design a change initiative coming out of it. Do you want us to try to do this together? This is the goal. That was my idea for the workshop today. I just want to emphasize one last time the difference between a more individual approach to consumption and a practice-based approach to consumption. Because essentially what I'm suggesting to you today is the way that you frame a problem is going to inform the kind of solution that you bring forward and implement. Problem framing is critical. It is essential. If you decide that the problem is about individuals who are not behaving better, you will come up with an information campaign to inform people to behave better, right? So this is how problem framing influences solutions and then influences outcomes ultimately. So the idea is, how would a social practice problem framing lead you to different solutions and different impacts? Again, I don't want to say that this approach is perfect. It just comes after many decades of realizing that we are not doing enough to engage everyday people. And maybe it is because we are not close enough to the everyday life dynamics that we're trying to change. That is what this theory is proposing. It is saying, rather than think of people as individuals, what happens if we look instead at practices like driving a car, preparing a meal, etc., and we try to really understand that practice and intervene, not at the level of the individuals, but at the level of the practice. I don't know, are you convinced or not? Let's see. We'll try together, okay? I wanted to just mention before we get into the workshop part that I will not today be able to expand on this topic. If you're interested, we can discuss it in the question and answer session, but increasingly we are also trying to tie this approach to the notion of well-being and the good life, because we're realizing that consumption particularly is really tied up with aspirational ideas of what it means to live the good life, what it means to be a good citizen, etc. And so more and more we are trying to work on well-being approaches to say, how can people distinguish the goal, which is to live a secure life, to be healthy, etc., from the means? So can we achieve a better standard of living for everyone with less energy and material resource intensity? This is another area of research that we can, I think, has very strong practical implications and that we can also discuss if you wish later. The social practice approach that I'm proposing today is something we're also using quite a bit with participatory methods in Switzerland. So I have done workshops with consumers or projects with consumers, and also with city officials or state level officials to think of interventions in the policy arena. I wanted to give you some examples of the projects we've done. So the project on the left was called the Jeans Challenge. And we recruited some 15, 20 people. We gave them a pair of jeans and we told them to wear the same pair of jeans for 4 weeks without washing it. And when we recruited people to participate, it was very amusing because some people would come up to us and say, oh no, I wear my jean once and I put it to wash. Other people would say, what do you mean 4 weeks? I wear my jeans for 2 months until they start walking alone. You know, I don't need to wash them. And we got a diverse group of 15, 20 people. Okay, it was a very small project, a pilot project, but we tried to intervene in this practice of cleaning by really contesting norms and expectations around cleanliness. So we told them, okay, wear your jeans for 4 weeks, at least 5 times a day without washing them. And what we noticed is that for the first 2 weeks, everyone was really concerned about how others would consider them as being unclean. In Switzerland, we have an expression, être propre sur soi. To be clean means to be respectable in society. And in every culture, I'm sure in Armenia, you have something about cleanliness. Do you have some saying about cleanliness? It's not a saying? No? Okay, well, maybe there is, I don't know. But anyway, they were all very concerned about being presentable, and they had all these strategies for not washing their jeans, like hanging them to air out, or maybe someone put their jean in the freezer, which in terms of energy usage is a little questionable. But then for the last 2 weeks, they realized that no one had noticed they were wearing the same pair of jeans, and they themselves started reconsidering their own norms and social habits around washing. they reduced their washing needs to wash, and they started reflecting on other areas of their everyday life where maybe they overconsume. So it was an interesting pilot project, and it was a fun one, I have to say, because cleanliness is something that is very personal. And it was interesting to see the different ways that people represent cleanliness. On the right, we did another project using this social practice theory approach, this time around heating. Again, I realize that we're in Armenia, where maybe not everyone has access to enough energy for heating. I'm sure energy poverty is very real here in Armenia. In Switzerland, it's less the case. There are a lot of subsidies to make sure that people have access to warm homes. And the problem we have is overheating. People heating around 24 degrees, let's say, in the winter. So we did a challenge using social practice theory to really contest norms and expectations around comfort in the home, where, for example, we brought forward two main ideas. One was, why do you heat a space rather than heating a person? So is it necessary to heat your whole house when no one is even there? Does the couch need heating? Or rather, should we think of ways of heating ourselves, maybe by wearing different clothes, by wearing a sweater indoors, etc.? I don't know how it is here, but it's become completely normal in Europe to wear a t-shirt all year round. It's as though we don't even know what the climate is outside anymore. We just dress the same way the whole year. And so this has become also part of our understanding of what it is to be comfortable. And how can we challenge this? So we did a challenge where we asked these households to reduce little by little their indoor temperature to 19 degrees. And these challenges are very effective because people know that they are for a limited time. They sign up, they know it's for 4 weeks. Oftentimes, one person in the household anyway would like to reduce the heat, and it's a way of engaging the rest of the members of the household to play along. And there was no big gender difference, I must say, around this idea that women tend to be colder, men tend to be warmer. But there were a lot of differences even in one same body, you know, cold feet, warm hands, this kind of thing. There were some very interesting insights on how people relate to comfort. And I should say it was a European project. 300 households around Europe were engaged, and all of them managed to reduce their heat without any technological intervention. This is what to me is so interesting and important. Just working on habits, just working on norms and expectations, we were able to reduce energy usage here, documented through temperatures, quite dramatically, from the starting point to the ending point, and even 3 months after the end of the challenge. Did you have your hand up?
I was going to ask, did it affect their food consumption?
Their food consumption?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So did it affect their food consumption? What they have in their hands are these, or alcohol consumption, good question. What they have in their boxes are these challenge kits that we prepared. As much as possible, we tried to do locally sourced items. They would open like Christmas time, you know, they were very happy to open their box at the start of the challenge. And in that, they would have things like herbal tea. What else did we put? Some socks, warm socks. We put a game. But there were some very amusing things about how people keep warm. One person said that she had a computer screen with the fireplace, image of a fireplace. And even this visual representation gave her a sense of warmth, right? And then people were also saying that they were spending more time, let's say, in the bedrooms together to stay warm. That was also one of the findings. But more seriously, 18 degrees was too cold for many people. They were able to come to 18, 19 degrees in the bedroom. And there again, it was associated with better sleep and better health. But in other rooms, more social rooms, it was more 19, 20 degrees. And of course, one thing we must always keep in mind, which I don't know if we'll have time to get to in the workshop today, is this question of diversity, that different people have different needs. There is no one standard when it comes to indoor temperatures. elderly people who are less mobile definitely need 1 or 2 degrees more than people that are more active and mobile. If you're working from home, you need higher temperatures than if you are just going home for sleeping or socializing. So, are you ready to do a workshop with me? Are you interested in doing a workshop? I was hoping that you would work together at tables. Yes.
Maybe you can help. It's 7 seconds.
All right, okay. There you go.
There's a very interesting approach to this social practice approach. I'm wondering, you said you focused on consumption mostly, but there's a form of activity in production that's not very different from consumption, because producers consume also, right?
Right.
Especially if you come not at a big industrial level, but small household farmers. Let's say if I'm a I'm a governor working with in a government, regional government office, and I want to work with my small farmers, farmers, small scale farmers, to change their fertilizer use habits, right? Or to change their habits around collection of animal waste, let's say, to do energy production and all that. I'm assuming this model could also be applied in those contexts, right? So,
No, absolutely. Anytime you have a practice you want to change, it's a model that is useful. I should have said at the beginning, when I say consumption, I'm usually talking about households, but of course, industries consume, small businesses consume, and consumers also produce. They produce their own food. They might even be producing their own energy, right? When you have solar PV on your roof. So sometimes the production consumption dichotomy is a little bit artificial. And certainly this approach can be used for any practice that you want to understand or change. I might just skip to the very last slide to say that there are things that this approach is not very good at, including it is not very good at when it comes to looking at power dynamics, for example. It's not very good when you want to consider a practice that is related to market dynamics. It's not the best tool for that. It tends to be used more for everyday life dynamics, but it can be applied to others.
I understand the concept of changing from individual to systemized approach. What I'm thinking about in the end is that if you want to improve the practices of people or habits, don't you go back again to the individual level of working with the habits of individuals again? So isn't it kind of also it's kind of the same logic again to what is being already implemented now, because you have to inform again people so that they understand why they are supposed to change their habits. So what is your solution to that?
Thank you.
Ben?
That's an excellent question. It's true.
Thank
At
you.
the end of the day, we're talking about individuals that are consumers or citizens. You're absolutely right. I guess in the theory, the way they describe it theoretically is they say people carry practices. That's how they sort of get around it. They say everybody here carries practices. But what I find interesting compared to a more psychological or marketing approach is that, for example, when I engage in the practice of preparing a meal, I may have different convictions and values than when I engage in the practice of getting around. Same person, but maybe more of an environmental set of values around food than around transport. So by looking at the practice itself, I find it gets us away from this overly individual psychological approach to consumption. But it doesn't mean that, of course, at the end of the day, you're working with people, you're engaging people. In terms of how to engage people, I'm also working quite a lot with critical participatory action research, saying that
the way that we approach people should not be moralistic. It should not be about telling people what is good or bad. And this is where I think social practice is helpful as well, because it's about saying we want to understand why we do what we do. Why is it a habit? Why has it become a routine? Let us understand, and then together work on these interventions or ideas to help change that practice or experiment new ways of doing, which is why the challenge as a method is very effective. It creates the space and time where people can experiment with something new. And then whether or not the habit is changed over the long term is open. I think, yeah. Good.
Actually, so eventually,
Yes.
economic, putting in economic implications on people is the most effective way, you could say. So have you looked at the governmental intervention in terms of policy, in terms of taxing, in terms of like how that could bring into, yeah.
So the question of price is a very important one. And somehow in Europe, we haven't much dealt with this question. At the end of the day, the question of price reveals, in some instances, social inequalities. I'm actually convinced today, we talk a lot about the ecological transition, right? The energy transition. We are not anymore in an energy or ecological transition. For me, we are in adaptation already, finished, right? We are in a transition of social injustice. Some people will be able to pay for their gas and others will not. So when you only work at the level of prices, you run the risk of exacerbating inequality. I'm not saying that they're not effective, but in Manila, you have very wealthy households that are air conditioning their entire homes with doors open onto the swimming pool because they can afford it. So if it just comes down to price, the harder thing to change are social norms. And that's where I think this approach is most effective, about looking at social norms around car culture, around meat consumption, and trying to tackle them. But even there, it can be problematic because by contesting a norm, you can reinforce it. So in the US, there was an environmental movement that was against SUV cars, 4x4 cars. People came out with their SUV 4x4 cars saying this is our freedom of choice. And you will always get at this question of freedom of choice. But there again, I think social practice theory is effective because it shows that there's not much freedom of choice going on here. There are material arrangements that make it easier to drive than to take a bike. There are social norms, and all these things have to be understood together. It's not perfect.
Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. I just wanted to mention briefly the example of another study, which your example with the decreasing temperatures, I remembered right away, was I think in some city in North America, they just they chose couple streets, and for every next house, so not all of them, just every second one, they moved the electricity meters, which people usually, or the water meters, I don't know, which people usually keep downstairs in the basement somewhere, they move them closer to the entrance. So every time you enter the house, you see the number. So that directly kind of, for that every, and then they again survey the monthly consumption, that would result in that those exact houses where people would see the numbers every time they enter the house, lowering their consumption very significantly. So that might be an example of this direct informing, right, of consumers of what are they doing, and the drivers there would be, we all, I guess, assume just the way that you directly see how much money you spend, you see those numbers changing everywhere. So these are the drivers. So my question would be, what do you think? So I totally understand the idea of you embedding those people in kind of different social ways or norms kind of made them to think differently. But what do you think in the end were those drivers which really made them to switch down to 19 degrees if they're still keeping those, because maybe all the people around them are still consuming the same 24 degrees. So the culture is, the dominant culture is still stable, the same. So what are the drivers for them to preserve it? Thanks.
Thank you for these really excellent questions. I feel like I could. Is it on? Yes, it is on. Yeah. Thank you for these, both of your excellent questions. So there are many answers. That example you're giving of making energy or water consumption visible has its limits, in the sense that studies that I've seen in the UK by Tom Hargreaves, for example, around metering, demonstrate that there is this initial phase where you do get more information from the meter and you may adjust your consumption. But somehow it might normalize higher levels of consumption. If you realize that all of your neighbors have been consuming more than you, you might say, I've been consuming less, maybe I should consume more. So that example shows that without having a broader discussion on this idea of sufficiency and what is necessary and what should be a standard in terms of energy usage or water usage, rendering it visible is only one step of the process. And in fact, a lot of people tire of these meters over time. So they come in as a bit of a novelty and people are interested in them, but then over time they may also become uninterested in them. I'm not saying that they're not useful. Information is useful, but to me, there needs to be a goal. That's where this idea of motivation comes in. What is the goal that we are suggesting to people? And these forms of experimentation can be effective because a lot of our knowledge is not just in our minds, it is embodied, right? In how we carry ourselves in relation to comfort, etc. And so I really like experiments that sort of engage people in trying out new ways of doing. So I gave you the gene example and the heating example, but there have been some other very interesting studies where, for example, people hand over their car keys for an electric bicycle for 2 weeks. And they test it out, they try it out. So anything we can do to get people to experiment towards the goal of reducing energy usage is, I think, interesting. Yeah. But like I said, not perfect. I mean, this is just one idea and one approach. If it's useful to you, then you use it. If it's not useful to you, if you have other kinds of questions you're dealing with, then we have to find other approaches, right? Yeah, the motivation around indoor comfort was very much related to health. It was interesting. I mean, some of the feedback we got is that people felt that they slept better in cooler temperatures. So that was one of the main motives that they had. But it is true that when you are doing these kinds of campaigns, you tend to recruit people who are already interested in energy issues. What we tried to do with the European project was we recruited people individually. So of course, people who said, I want to do something for energy. Already this is a small percentage of the population. But then we said, let's recruit in a community of place. Let's go to one big building. Let's get 1 or 2 neighbors involved. So I would recruit my mom here to go in her building. And then she would go and the person we recruited would get everyone in the building on board. And this was a way of having a more diverse group of people who weren't necessarily interested, but through sort of peer-to-peer influence joined the campaign. We also talk in this approach about communities of practice, going, for example, to sports clubs or other kinds of clubs or associations where people already have a sense of community and working with those communities to bring more diverse people on board. Yeah. And then maybe another way to answer your question, a criticism we often get is, okay, 300 households in Europe, 40 households in Geneva, but this is nothing, right? It's a very small amount of people that engaged in this challenge. I find that media partners are very effective. So we had a media partner in Switzerland that followed a household before and after the challenge. And this got a few minutes on the evening news in Geneva, which reaches some 200,000 people, 300,000 people. And the news item was about, why have we normalized a t-shirt all year round? Of course, we can lower our temperatures and wear a sweater. What's really interesting now in Europe is because of the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis, we are being told in Switzerland there will not be enough energy this winter for everyone to stay warm. So now people are calling me and asking, how can we do this challenge at the scale of an entire city? And I think with media partners and information campaigns, you can get people to be engaged to do a challenge to lower temperatures. Anyway, let's see. I'll come back in a year and let you know how it went.
I just want to bring an example that in Armenia, it depends on your engine that you can pay more taxes. So sometimes when they are just choosing the car, they are looking how much they are going to pay for that. So I just wondered if there is any studies on the taxes, like that is influencing on people. So how have you done anything on that?
I haven't myself, but I know that Singapore is a very emblematic example of car tax. I think to have a car in Singapore, your license plate alone costs 10,000 euros or something like this. So there are almost no private cars in Singapore. But again, it raises this question of inequalities, which I'm very sensitive to. I did a development studies PhD, and I don't know if you heard about the yellow vests in France. This big movement among citizens in France, they were originally protesting a carbon tax. So there's a saying in French, end of the world, end of the month. It's not the same idea for different people. Some people can barely make ends meet at the end of the month. Others are thinking of the end of the world and climate change. So how do we create initiatives that are as inclusive as possible? And again, I really don't have all the solutions, right? But we're trying to propose another approach that maybe is a little bit more grounded in everyday life dynamics. Yes.
Do you think it's possible to make change through social practices without any political action or like systemic change? Because I can give the example of Lake Sevan, my research about that. And so, for example, the consumption of fish, and for Sevan now has a campaign to make people, to convince people to consume less fish or to not fish, etc., etc. But when I talk to fishermen or locals, they always question the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of knowledge. Who is the state to tell us what to do? The scientists don't know what they're talking about, because there is a conflict of power and legitimacy, and these people are the people who are the poorest in the countries, and you can't tell them not to fish when that's the basic source of income,
livelihood. Yeah.
And at the same time, when the state is not doing what's necessary to keep the huge polluters from polluting the lake, for example. And the reason why the lake is now blooming is because the level has decreased over time, and the state allows for extra, for more water to be extracted, etc., etc. So without a systemic change, whatever you talk about consumption, even if you consider these elements, people, when they're questioning the legitimacy, they can't really cooperate to change their practices. So,
absolutely.
And globally too, when mines continue mining and the big industries are exempt from taxes, for example, even if we try to change social norms, this minority, the rich minority, is going to keep for their own profits is going to continue their practices, which are more harmful, I think, than the practices of the community.
That absolutely. There's a huge body of research emerging right now in Europe on elite consumption practices and how they are responsible, highly responsible for different environmental impacts. You're right. I guess this approach is about starting from consumption dynamics, but then working your way up to the points that you raised: regulatory frameworks, infrastructure. All of these things have to be taken into account in this perspective. At the end of the day, the solutions that you might propose must intervene among more than one element. So whatever unsustainable practice you're looking at, you will uncover that it might have to do with bike lanes, availability or not of bike lanes in cities, or road safety issues, road safety rules. So while the approach starts from the dynamics of everyday life, it is intended to look at the systems of production, systems of provision that make some forms of consumption more sustainable than others. So you absolutely are right. We cannot be blindsided to the more regulatory dimension, right, of changing practices. Now, I was saying earlier to Alan and his team over a coffee that somehow our imaginaries of how people should be involved in change are very limited. If you ask 100 people in Switzerland, how should you engage as a citizen in the ecological transition, 99% will talk about individual acts of consumption. I will recycle, I will, not buy bottled water, I won't fly, what have you. Very few people will say, I'm going to organize collectively for my neighborhood to put in place XYZ solution or service. So we are poor when it comes to imaginaries of collective change and how they can be brought about. So I think social practice theory does one thing. It helps understand everyday life dynamics. It helps understand routines and habits in relation to these different dimensions. But when it comes to actually implementing a change initiative, how to foster more collective understandings of change is something that we, even in a so-called participatory democracy in Switzerland, we are really struggling with this question of how to engage people collectively to bring forward change. I think we're having a very rich discussion. Will we do the, yeah.
Just, I guess it's kind of embedded in that box on the right-hand bottom corner. But I mean, if you want to get people to promote, scooter riding or bicycle riding in a city, you will not get, my sense is you will not get mass transition to those forms of transport unless the infrastructure is in place. Because safety, personal safety and all that is a big concern for people. And, there are crazy people like me who ride scooters anyway on streets and all that. And I don't ride it on sidewalks, which people seem to want to do here in Yerevan. But, this necessary condition for it to even take place, I think it's for a lot of this work is critical. Yeah.
I wanted to try and find a slide. I had like some slides hidden that I wanted to show you, but I can't seem to find it. But essentially the last IPCC report says just that. For the first time, they've introduced this notion of sufficiency, so the need to reduce demand, but they're saying it's not the same across different sectors. There are some sectors like mobility that are going to need more infrastructure change, and other sectors like food consumption that are going to need more changes when it comes to the normative dimension and cultural dimension. So not every consumption domain can be treated in the same way. But I think what's sort of the exercise I wanted to do, but I don't think we're going to have time, and I'm also happy to just keep discussing with you, is if you pick a unsustainable practice, so what would you say in Armenia is a consumption practice that you might want to change or challenge? Does anyone have a proposal? What do we put in the middle here as an unsustainable practice? Do you want to talk about car dominance, or should we talk about meat, or what would you like to talk about? Cars? All right, I was like cars. So if we take driving around by car as the problem, you should be able to detail all of the different ways in which that practice is made possible in Armenia. So does anyone want to give some ideas? For example, in terms of the material arrangements, is it easy in Yerevan to get around by bike? Are there bike lanes? No. And what about public transport?
It's uncomfortable, it's unsanitary.
So public transport is uncomfortable, it's unsanitary. So you would pick away at all of the reasons why the car is problematic in terms of a practice of getting around. What about the normative dimension of cars here? Very clearly, right? Cars seem to be a status symbol in Armenia. How do you counter that culture? How could you address that? What about skills, know-how, beliefs? Do people learn to drive a car at a very young age? Is that something that is put forward as being a rite of passage? Like once you learn how to drive a car, you are an adult or something like this? In the United States, there has always been this strong association between car and freedom. But now as people are moving into cities, in the United States, less young people are getting driver's licenses because cities have become difficult places to have cars. Could the same thing happen in Armenia? Could you try making, like an experiment might be to make certain streets pedestrian in the summer, or make it really difficult to have your car in the city? And how would that change the way people get around? I know some of these ideas may seem impossible, but somehow we have to start somewhere. And the only suggestion with this approach is that it's never just one element. It's never enough to just change one element. This approach is about choosing several elements and intervening in those different elements. Maybe I can give you another example from my own work. I looked at water consumption in London at a time when the city of London was trying to promote what they called a London on Tap campaign. They had a campaign to promote tap water over bottled water, but it wasn't working. They were doing blind tests where everyone said the water of the tap was better than Evian or whatever. There was obviously a price incentive. The water coming from the tap was free, but people were still going out and buying bottled water. But they intervened in a specific practice, the practice of ordering bottled water in restaurants. They did a campaign with restaurants to offer a carafe, a water cask that was done by some designer. There was a competition around this, and made it very acceptable for people to ask for this tap water in restaurants, and bottled water sales went down. So from a practice approach, what they did is they changed what was acceptable or not in a certain setting. They introduced a new material element, this designer carafe. And then, of course, there was a lot of media around this, etc. But how could we do something similar in Armenia around maybe ordering food in restaurants? Could there be a campaign with restaurants to provide vegetarian, like a month of vegetarian meals? Everyone's laughing. No way. Takeaway, how to normalize takeaway. So food waste could be an interesting example. The question of food waste in restaurants and how it comes about, and how to normalize taking away through a campaign where you get different restaurants on board. So it's true that the solutions, to your point, are not necessarily consumption-based solutions. They have to engage the sector in which you're interested in. So whether it's restaurants or etc. So what you do with this approach, what we would have done is outline these different dimensions of the practice, and then you come up with these different points of change. So, okay, one change point is looking at water usage in restaurants. And then another level of analysis, which can be very important, is thinking of who's included or who's excluded from such a campaign or such an initiative. So, if there are people that, for example, experience energy poverty and are not able to heat their homes enough. How do you account for that in a campaign about reducing indoor temperatures, for example? So we didn't do the workshop together, but I think you have an idea of how it would work. I hope it might be useful to you as a way to generate ideas. I also wanted to say that this question of justice is emerging as a very strong theme, and thinking of justice, I think, is a way of accounting for who is able to engage or not in some of the initiatives that we're proposing. And then this is what I was saying earlier, that links to well-being are increasingly coming forward as, you know, many of us working on environmental issues, we have always started from the problem. I have always started from the problem of waste, the problem of energy consumption, etc. By saying, let's start from well-being, you turn around, the story is a bit different. Let's start from what it means to live a good life. And then we work our way back to see what energy we need to do that. And this, I find, has become a very interesting way to engage people, not only citizens and consumers, but also in the public sector, policies oriented towards well-being, because that is something that people can rally around more than environmental issues. I don't know how it is here, but many people are just not interested in energy or the environment in Switzerland. But if you talk about well-being, then people are interested. What do you think? Is it something here that's, yeah? Yeah.
Poor person is to have food on their table. So this is kind of how you define the norms of well-being, and how that can be again implemented and communicated from the governments to say, hey, these are these norms of well-being, and we want the poor to come to this level, and we want the rich to adapt this and to reduce their expectations, and that comes back to the sufficiency issue that is now being discussed, but there is a huge resistance to this as well from rich persons.
Of course.
In America. We did a study actually I worked in Germany where we were looking at the bioeconomy evolution over time until 2015, and we were looking at 3 different scenarios where revolution in bioeconomy was one scenario, and that was including sufficiency and regulatory implementation or creating specific regulations where people would have to reduce their meat consumption, have only one car, I don't know, travel, there will be specific rules.
Yeah.
We were studying how was the acceptance
Mm-hmm.
and within a group of people, how would they accept that? And there was a huge resistance towards this specific scenario of reducing their consumption.
Absolutely. No. And I think that's where the collective dimension comes in. Change cannot just be about individuals consuming less. There have to be changes at a collective level that make it easier for everybody, or even mandatory for everybody, to not have a car in the city or what have you. Yeah, no, it's a good point. When I talk about well-being, I often use a list of human needs. In general, well-being is a very long philosophical tradition, right? And for some people, well-being is about happiness. I myself don't work with happiness or life satisfaction because it is very subjective. And for example, you could live in the perfect city like Geneva, which has free public transport, free education, affordable public transport, and you can still be very unhappy. And there are a lot of unhappy people in Geneva. We should bring them to Yerevan, actually, where everyone seems to be. No, you don't want them. No, thank you. So it's hard to design policies around happiness or life satisfaction because you can still have miserable people no matter what you do, right? So we work with human needs. This is another tradition in the well-being literature. There's a big debate whether it's capabilities or needs, but putting that aside, this is one of the lists I work with. And so these needs are very different from desires, and they're distinguished from the means of satisfying. So a TV is a satisfier, a car is a satisfier. A need is something different. A need is something like being able to perform activities that are valuable to you, being part of a community, having a say in the shaping of society, being granted protection, so feeling safe, feeling free, etc., etc. But we are not really used to talking at this level, right? We often do not have these kinds of conversations that are so essential around human well-being. People who create these lists have a sense that these should be universal needs. Everyone in the world at all time. So some anthropologists don't like this. They want it to be a little bit more, bottom up or relative. It's a bit universalist, but it's useful as a tool. I've used these lists before to compare well-being in different cities. For example, we did a project on parks, public parks in Singapore, Chennai, Manila, and Shanghai, to show that going to the park fulfills almost every single human need, much more than a shopping center. The subtext of the project was how to get rid of shopping centers as the only way of imagining leisure, and instead promoting more green open spaces, which we saw during the pandemic are essential, right? Even more so. So these lists of needs, I think, are helpful in that respect. And a lot of research is emerging on engaging citizens and reflecting on well-being in these terms and thinking, okay, can we still achieve high levels of well-being, but instead of the car, using the bike? And then, of course, you have to change the infrastructure. There are a lot of things that have to change, but it's a more salutogenic and positive approach, I find, to sustainability, starting from these kinds of lists than to start from the problem of climate crises, energy, insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, maybe I'm just an optimist person. I like to have...
We have several representatives of regional governments, Mars-Petarans, local governments, national government. It would be interesting to hear what kinds of consumption patterns changed would support their work. So, water consumption, what is it? Fertilizer, artificial fertilizer consumption. What is it that is kind of at the center of what the work they do?
That's right. I would very much like to hear from people who are here representing national or local governments. What are your main preoccupations, or when it comes to consumption? Would anyone like to share? Who is here from? Oh, you don't want to be put on the spot. No? Water is big, yeah.
Going back to your question about how it's in Armenia from south and north, different perspectives and different consumption issues. Of course, and cars are looked at differently. In some communities, it's just a matter of safety. And in some communities, there is no access to public transport, and it's a must, absolute must. So in Armenia, it's like every region, every community needs different research and different approaches. It could be totally different projects, probably like many other places. In terms of Yerevan, I agree that cars are more like luxury status, not for us, for example, because again, I have a public transport issue, and with kids, it's difficult. So car is becoming absolute must. For Alan mentioned about small farmholders and fertilizer issues. It's none of the government representatives talk about it. In my opinion, from the experience I had with smallholder farmers, in Armenia, there is this issue. The government usually provides fertilizers and subsidizes it during spring. So whatever government provides, it can be the accepted one. And especially if the benefits of the subsidizing percent is very high. In my opinion, from the experience that I dealt with smallholder farmers, they don't want their soils. They don't want their soils to be degraded. And of course, they would be happy not to implement traditional methods, but it's a matter of some support, because most like about 95% of our farms are smallholder farmers are smallholder farmers. So it becomes absolute necessity from the government to act here and to provide normal and good quality, for example, fertilizers. In my opinion, in villages, especially in rural communities, especially which are more like poor compared to other countries and Yerevan, I think if the government acts there actively, is active there with subsidizing and with investing, it would be easier to change the norms, especially if it's related to agriculture norms. In my opinion, at least my opinion. Everyone from the community wants to.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Indeed, if from a practice perspective, it is that subsidy that provides a regulatory framework and a monetary, let's say, assistance to make fertilizers the dominant practice. But then we could also try to look at the skills and competencies around not using synthetic fertilizers. So are there traditions around composting, for example, organic composting that can be revived, or ways of sharing skills and competencies around composting? We're trying to do this also in Switzerland, actually. It is not obvious. A lot of people are not, a lot of farmers are not used to these more traditional methods of composting, but that could be maybe a skill and competency that could be looked at least, or revived somewhat. In another research project we have between Switzerland and Cameroon, we're looking at how household food waste can be collected at a municipal level along with organic waste to create composting to replace artificial fertilization. But yeah, it's a big issue in terms of soil degradation, indeed. Although we were in the Gyumri area a few days ago, and we were told that a lot of farmers are doing organic, not because it's organic, but because somehow it's cheaper to not use artificial fertilizers. So is there still a strong, let's say, tradition of doing organic agriculture in Armenia?
There is, it is becoming more trendy now, but it's not, we cannot say it's strong, because it takes some patience and time and literacy. More in Gyumri is not one of the agricultural like hotspots in Armenia. If you go to the most the areas like Ararat region and the places where it's more agriculture is more intensive, but then the traditional, of course, prevails. It's not that easy to change. Of course, where in the fields where it's possible and it's easier, like through harvesting, wild harvesting, or honey, or which doesn't require a lot of patience, for example. It's easier, and non-traditional high-value crops also are becoming more and more popular, and also they are testing non-traditional high-value crops in the already degraded soils to kind of
revive them.
No, I would not say it's a tendency.
No, but to me, organic, I didn't mean like the organic label, but more that there are traditional ways of doing that have always been organic somehow. And whether, this is still, but you're saying that maybe it's not dominant in the more larger agricultural.
No, it's not just
right.
Because they have to have high
productivity, so it's more labor intensive also. Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sure.
So just one general thing. I think working in Armenia, we should consider the mentality things here. So for instance, when we were starting about teaching people about recycling, we just know that it's better to reduce, to reuse than recycle. But in Armenia, it's like when people start to recycle, they started to see how much solid waste they are generating. And after that, they just started to think about absosa. Like it's think like that, I don't know how to say exactly in English, like it's shame. And after that, they started to think how to reduce. And then just after that, some of them started to reuse even. So when we think to do something in Armenia, we should consider all those things that I was just looking what was going on in the villages. So in villages, we have like almost like better life than in Yerevan, because they all of them thinking how to reuse once at least, and then to throw it. For instance, they are using plastic bottles for milk because they do not have anything else to sell it. And another thing is that I have learned that, for instance, when they are like killing the cows and they are taking their skin, they are taking the skin to the factories to use them. So actually in the villages, those things are well, because they do not have more money than in cities, and they are just finding the way how to reduce the way. So I just think that, okay, if we want to achieve something in the cities, at first we should teach people what they do exactly, that they see the numbers, see and feel that, and after that we can have some results.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think this comes to a very critical question of what does it mean to be an ecological consumer? And actually, there are plenty of ecological consumers in Armenia, in the countryside, that have always been doing things a certain way, out of need, out of necessity, out of habit, etc. The problem that we're seeing in Europe, a big question is, do you have to become rich and access everything that a consumer society has to offer before then having an environmental conscious and engaging in sufficiency? Is it necessary for everyone to go through this pathway of having 2 cars, a big home, to then say, now I have the luxury of thinking of how maybe we should reduce? Or should we instead be looking at existing practices of sufficiency and really promoting them and showing that these are demonstration sites of good practices and good ways of living and rendering them more visible? And I think that's a very important question in a country like Armenia, where maybe in the countryside, the consumer lifestyle has not taken off the way that it has maybe in the capital city. So, yeah.
Also, there's this big pressure from business and marketing where consumption is equated with happiness. The more you consume, the happier you are. And the imagery that is sold, people are bombarded with happy, smiling people with shopping bags and things like that. So I think there's a very big pressure. And this is where I think it's powerful the way you're approaching it, where you're starting with the question of well-being. What is a happy life? And then coming back to.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alan. Historically, in sociology, there was, in the interwar period, a strong critique of the marketing industry. People were talking of the culture industry that was basically manipulating people to be consumers. So it was all about looking at advertising, the role of, even the invention of credit cards, all of these things. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was a turn towards a more cultural understanding of consumption, saying, wait a minute, okay, maybe we're being manipulated, but there is something fun and rewarding about consumption. There are rituals of consumption that are important to all of us. So there were these 2 extremes. And I think today we're at a point where we have to account for all of that. We have to account and recognize there are moments of consumption that are very meaningful to people, and we can't avoid it. If at Christmas you don't give presents, or I don't know what, maybe there are moments that we still have to recognize. We still have to recognize the power of industry. In Geneva, there are campaigns to get rid of advertising, for example, but then the city says, yes, but the advertising that we sell is financing culture in Geneva. So how do you get out of these sort of vicious circles, right? Or maybe you choose what you can advertise. Maybe we shouldn't be advertising low-cost airlines, and we should be advertising, I don't know, bicycle shops or what have you. But I think now we're at a point where we have to bring all of these understandings of consumption together and recognize the ways in which consumption are also meaningful to people. We can't avoid that. I wanted to say I'm really grateful to be here today, to be sharing with you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I really would like to learn from you as well. I have my email address here, and I'm in, I think it should be on the first page. You can find me though easily online. And I'm here until, I forgot to put my email, but I'm here until mid-August. And if there are other opportunities to exchange with you, with your students, with other people in your associations or departments, let me know. And just thank you so much again to the organizers, to the translator. I don't know if there are any other questions you have, or I'll stay also a little bit afterwards if you want, we can exchange. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.